Hello everyone. Today on World Mental Health Day, we are talking about the future of workplace well-being and the importance of looking after your employees' mental health. I'm delighted to be joined by Glen Ridgway, who went through a serious breakdown himself a few years ago, but who used that experience to help his then employer build a formal strategy that would help other employees in the future. He is director at the Workplace Wellbeing Academy and spends his time advising organisations about the best strategy to create a motivated and engaged workforce where mental health support is a given. As always, we welcome your questions, so please do pop those into the chat as we go along, and Glen and I will try and answer those as we get them. Welcome again, and glad to have your company today. So Glen, thank you so much for joining us. Delighted to have you along today. Perhaps we could start by talking about your own experience of mental health and how that breakdown played out and affected you all those years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Jane, for having me on today. Yeah, I mean, I had my first breakdown in 2008. I was a team leader and project manager in an organisation down here in Exeter, and I used to when I went to I'm a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, and I enjoy my job. I've always enjoyed. I'd say, for the most part, I've enjoyed the work that I do. And I used to sing when I got to work. Oh, what a wonderful morning. Oh, what a wonderful day. Mainly because what it was, and two, it really irritated people. So that was a bonus. But sometime in 2008, I stopped singing, and I didn't realise what was happening. And then in September, we have a lot of family birthdays in September, and we live by the beach. So work was extremely busy. Life outside of work was extremely busy. And I was dealing with a couple of problem projects. And it wasn't until much later on I realised I was the problem. But every decision I seemed to make made things worse. And eventually it came to a head, and I had a breakdown in the middle of the office. I went into one of the smaller offices and essentially just broke down crying. And a colleague came, found me, and he took me for a wander down the river, because we worked near a river, and I was able to pull myself together for the rest of the day. And I went home, and the following morning I literally could not get out of bed. I was in tears. I was in bits. It freaked my wife out, as you can imagine. But eventually that day we did manage to get an emergency appointment with the doctor. And she signed me off for 2 weeks. She wanted to sign me off for 3 months, but I couldn't accept that. And she put me on antidepressants. So that was actually the start of my recovery. And as I sort of, I was off work for full time for 3 months. So the doctor was right at the end, and part time for another 3 months, and then probably another year before I said I would say I was back firing on all cylinders again. And another 6 months after that, I had my second breakdown. So I do have, I've probably had 7 or 8 depressive episodes in the last 14, 15 years. So it's with me. I know it's with me. Fortunately, probably I would say not in the last 3 years, but yeah, it's with me. I know it's with me, and I know I've got to manage to keep my sort of routines going, if you like, in order to be able to thrive and survive. So.
And you said, Glen, that this had happened after a long period of being pretty happy in your work. Looking back, do you know, have you any idea what happened and why you suddenly had that first breakdown, and why it's something that you continually now have to manage? Is it something that perhaps you'd masked before, or?
The honest answer is I had no idea I was poorly. I mean, in 2008, mental illness and depression and anxiety just weren't part of the conversation. So I just assumed that the sleepless nights were part of the expectation. I was the governor. I was the boss. So it's what they paid me the money for, is to stress out about these things. So sleepless nights came as sort of just a consequence of that. Yeah. The result of those sleepless nights, which mean I became more irritable, and family life became more difficult, was just a consequence of that. I mean, I'd rarely try. It's rarely in my career have I worked on a Saturday, but Sundays were always fair game. So I would be downstairs, I would be on my laptop, my family would be doing what my family do around me, but I was there, I was engaging with them, wasn't I? So I mean, it was all that sort of stuff. So, and I just didn't recognise the fact that I was not in a good place.
So how did that? How did you find support at the time? Because as you say, at that stage, 2008, mental health wasn't really a kind of a thing in terms of employer responsibility, I guess. So how did you get help apart from obviously your wife sort of alerting the doctor?
Well, when I fell over, I mean, there wasn't there wasn't the formal support. We did have an EAP, but I didn't know anything about it, and I didn't actually start using the EAP until I started going back to work part-time, and that worked for me. And I still see Jane every now and then now. But in terms of the formal support of work, there wasn't that there. It was very much reliant on the colleagues who I had, part of the team, part of the, if you like, the community that I was working. They're the ones that actually reassured me that everything was okay, reassured me that the work was being covered, and my job would be there at the end of it. But I will say that when you're told, when you're in the depths of despair and you're feeling worthless and completely completely worthless, hearing that's all right, you can, we've got your job covered, doesn't make you feel much better originally. It just makes you feel worse. However, it was the right thing to say, that constant reassurance that things were going to be okay, the job was going to still be there when I got back. That was the key thing for me in terms of that level of recovery.
So at what point did you reflect on all this and thought, you know what, I think I can do something about this. I think I can help companies understand a little bit better how to help somebody in this situation?
I think I'm a natural sort of I'm outgoing. So when I came back to work, I didn't hesitate. My immediate thought was, I really don't want anybody to go through what I went through. So I started to tell my story. So I would do lunchtime sessions, lunch and learn. I would travel to different offices and tell my story, which was quite cathartic for me. Hard work to start with, but quite cathartic. But what I began to realise was that I was never the only one in the room. Other people would either raise their hand and tell their story, or they would seek me out afterwards. So, and I also found out that I wasn't the only one doing that. There was probably two others within the organisation that I was aware of. One was a fairly senior manager, and we had an internal sort of social media platform, and so we started a Wellbeing page on that platform. And we started to grow, get interest from across the globe. I mean, Jacobs was a global company, and that's when we realised that this wasn't just a UK issue; it was a global issue. So that's when I suppose that's the realisation that it was a bigger issue than just depression or just the odd person falling over. It was a big issue.
And how sharing stories is obviously, how a lot of companies now start down this path of providing support and opening up that conversation in the workplace. But just sharing a story is going to have one effect. But how do you then widen that out to address mental health awareness within the complete organisation? What other things do you have to start thinking about to put in place a structure of support that's there?
Well, just to take that story a little bit further. So as I said, one of the other individuals was a senior manager, and she went to see our CEO at the time. It's about 2012, I think it was, and said, "Look, this is a subject. This is there's evidence here that it's concerning, and it's something that from around the globe. We need to do something. We need to talk about it. We need to and she got put very squarely in her place and told, no, this is not something we're going to do. And in 2015 we got a new CEO, so she tried again, and the message she got back was, what do you need from me to make this happen? Complete turnaround. And so she came to me in early 2016, said, we need a strategy, go do. So I went and did, and that was the start of the journey, the start of the process for Jacobs, in terms of actually beginning to understand that overall, what is it we're trying to achieve, what is it we're trying to create, and we started with Champions Networks, and that's and then we, by growing that and creating that network, it gave us a conduit to every office to sell the message and tell people that this is serious within this organization, and we do take this seriously. So that's where we started, and the benefit of that really is it's a very public face. It sends a very clear message of intent behind the organisation. So,
and today, when we're putting strategies in place for workplaces, it really does have to come down from the top, doesn't it? You see a lot of senior managers and CEOs now actually sharing their own experiences in order to prompt a conversation at different levels of the business. Do we feel?
Oh, absolutely. I think the important thing is that the C-suite, or the executive suite, they are the permission givers. They give permission to, and the resources for this to happen. But the energy has to come from the people who are going to be directly impacted by it, and that's the employees. That's where the energy and the direction has to come from, because they know what they need. You need to understand your employees. You need to understand their needs as you develop your strategy.
And how do you go about that? How do you go about assessing, what a workforce needs? It's quite an easy thing to say, and potentially quite
absolutely. It's in part. I mean, it's communication, but it's in part with champions, because they understand what's going on. So get that, establish them, get them involved. But also, you need to audit. You need to audit your employees. But it's absolutely pointless your audit being the first thing, because if you start by auditing and asking people about their well-being, their mental health and well-being, completely out of the blue, you're not going to get the response you want. So it has to, the audit. It's slightly counterintuitive, because you want to understand first before you do something. But actually, you need to do a little bit of prep work, and the Champions networks and those sorts of networks, they are that front face. They are They are an important part of the engagement piece. Communication, all that is absolutely vital, but that network is that first piece. Put them in place and use that momentum to then follow up with your audit, so people understand what you're actually trying to achieve.
So almost sort of action, creating people who will talk within the organisation and talk to their teams. And then the audit comes off the back of that. How easy is it to find wellbeing champions, mental health first aiders in an organisation? It's a small organisation as well,
No, it's a lot easier than we anticipated. When we started in the UK, which is where we launched initially, we said we wanted to create a network of, for, I think we were something like 10,000 people in the UK at the time. And we wanted to, don't ask me where this figure, I said something like 1 in 50. Yeah, I don't know where that, there's no science behind that. We just felt right. And each office should have a minimum of 2. So if it's an office of 25, we try and create. So let's say about 2. We wanted to create a network of about 200 people in the UK. So we put out a call for volunteers, and we got over 300 volunteers. So so the job then became about how do we actually, what is it we want to create in terms of that network. So we wanted people who are graduates, we wanted people at different levels of the organisation, across different parts of the organisation, within offices, on sites, all those sorts of things. So the selection process became about creating that ideal mix of people, if you like, rather than all senior managers and sort of all just managers, and etc. A graduate is going to be uncomfortable talking to a senior manager, and vice versa. So let's make sure that we have that sort of that representation throughout every level of the organisation.
How, we're talking post-pandemic now. How has the sort of hybrid workplace impacted on all this? In the days that you're talking about, pretty much people were in the office face to face or seeing each other out on a site visit, whatever. Today, it's quite different. You and I are talking virtually. A lot of people are at home, and their home and work life are becoming kind of intertwined. How has mental health strategy for an organisation been impacted by that?
I think you need to be more deliberate. When you're in the office, you absorb by osmosis in many ways. You overhear conversations, and you get a sense and a feel when an office is an engaged office and a sort of happy office, if you want to use the phrase happy. And you get that sense, and you absorb that. In the remote world, it has to be a lot more deliberate. So your managers have to reach out to their people. Or if that's not your natural style, some managers are great people, and they would do that naturally. Others are less so. So find somebody in your team who is a natural at that sort of thing, so that they are, they're the ones that are reaching out and touching base on a regular basis. Find opportunities wherever you can to have non-work conversations. So it is much more difficult, but it can still be done. In terms of looking at support mechanisms, so maybe digital platforms, access to EAPs, all those sorts of things, they're still there. And look about so optimizing your routes to support. Some people will go down the digital route. Some people are comfortable talking like this. Others would prefer to sit with for a cup of coffee or talk to a professional. Look to maximize those routes to support. Because we are all individuals, we all prefer to seek support or get that support in different ways. So
it was interesting that you sort of touched on the fact that it doesn't necessarily need to be a manager, and that's always quite an interesting one, isn't it? The people that might be able to reach out to others and have a fairly frank conversation, or at least keep an eye on people, are not necessarily the people that are leading the groups of people working on a project necessarily, do you think?
I think there are so many, and this is probably touching on dangerous ground, I suppose, accidental managers, if you want to call them that, people who've been promoted into that role without training, just because they're good at what they do. They're good technically, so they're promoted, and a promotion naturally leads into a management role. And we don't train managers particularly well. So there are people who would be, who are in that role that their skills are not people skills. So maybe there's something in there around how do we develop good managers, and that's I look at mental health and wellbeing as holistic, if you like. Yeah, there are lots of things that organisations do that, if done well, benefit well-being for people, but if done poorly, will undermine people's well-being. And the leadership and the management and the training and the development of management is one of those that if you do it well and you have good managers, then that's going to enhance your business and improve the well-being of your staff generally. Then if you have poor managers, we know this. We know the story. People don't leave organisations; they leave poor managers. So, and there's the consequence for it.
I was asked to ask you this by somebody. I said I was doing a chat with you today, and they did say, well, what's an example of bad practice? Can you give any examples of, of things that genuinely don't work?
Going back, micromanaging, if we think about managers, and actually trust is a big thing. And this, I think that's one of the areas where one of the biggest learnings from the pandemic is that suddenly, rather than everybody being in the office, they were at home. And organizations had to trust their people to do their 9 to 5, to do their job as they were. And building on that trust is a positive. Undermining that trust through either micromanaging or looking over people's shoulders or checking in on them or all these sorts of things, that is, I think, one of the fundamental routes to mismanagement. We have to trust our people. We have to engage our people. We have to provide them with the tools, the education, the training, all those sorts of things that enable them to grow within the organisation and to enhance their own opportunities within the organisation. Because as they grow with the organisation grows. If you don't give them that, you don't trust them to do that, then I think that's one of the bigger. If lots of others, but that to me is one of the fundamentals.
So trust is massive, and there's the impact of if people do leave because they're not happy in their work, that's a massive economic cost, isn't it? I mean, Deloitte bring out their mental health report every year, and I think the cost to a business and to the UK economy is shot up by about 25% over obviously the last couple of years. But businesses need to think about the economic impact of if they're not providing support and not creating what you describe as sort of engaged and motivated workforce. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a lot of really good stuff going on within this field, if you like, mental health and well-being. There's been a transition from when I was poorly, which was about how do we help people who have fallen over, falling off the edge of the cliff, I call it, and it's migrated. So it moved from there to how do we spot people who are heading towards the cliff and stop them from getting there, to the preventative approach, which is probably where we are now, and that is the sort of how do we keep people away from the cliff edge, put up fencing, lots of warning signs, etc., etc. How do we prevent them getting there in the first place? And that works. The preventative, I call it the deficit approach. The preventative approach works. Looking at risks, understanding the risks to well-being and mental health will save you money. I think the average is something like £1,700 per employee, as if you like the loss. So if it's 10,000, if you've got 1,000 employees, that's about 1.7 million per annum you're losing due to poor mental health and well-being. 10,000, you can do the maths. So you will save some of that money, big chunks of that money. So it's as a strategy, it works. Personally, my interest is how do we leverage the additional value of well-being? How do we So let's take diversity, inclusion and equality for equity, sorry, as an example. So lots and lots of really, really good work going on in there. People see the benefit of everybody from all walks of life, ethnicities, all that sort of stuff, being comfortable in their own skin, in the working environment and within the community they work. There's lots of good stuff going on in there. But how do we, let's take it beyond the sort of, okay, that's good and that's really good stuff, but how do we actually leverage the value of that difference? How do we bring those different perspectives, those different ways of looking at problems, those different life experiences to problem solving? How do we, how do we, and if we've got a problem, how do we innovate? How do we engage with those people and bring that stuff together? And that's what in many ways floats my boat in this sphere. It is leveraging that. How do we leverage that difference?
And what would be sort of some kind of best practice around that, Glenn?
That is the challenge.
You're the strategy guy. You should know.
And that's, so it's asking that extra question. So psychological safety is an obvious one where and this isn't the same as psychological health and safety. Psychological health and safety is what we're talking, the preventative approach we were talking about earlier on, about understanding the risks and managing those, mitigating, managing those risks. Psychological safety is about, it goes back to that trust element. It's how do we actually enable the people within the team to contribute fully to within that if you like, that project. So people can bring fresh ideas to the table, knowing that if the idea doesn't work, that's not a problem. It's because as long as you're contributing in a positive way, not looking to undermine, you allow people to bring those ideas and you discuss those ideas, and some will work, some will won't, some you'll progress, some others you won't. Some you'll progress to a point where suddenly it doesn't work, so you'll go backwards and you'll look at it. But it's all part of that learning experience. How do we create a learning environment where we look to solve a problem, not just to solve the problem, but in a way that we can solve the problem in a better way next time, or follow a process and improve that process and look at it in a better way next time. So it's that, I think psychological safety is probably a fundamental element of where I'm going with this.
It's funny, it's all talking to, it's almost like we've got off the subject of mental health, but we haven't, because essentially it's how you treat your team, your colleagues, being open to ideas, helping them to manage workloads, I guess, and encouraging people to feel that they are very much a part of what's happening in a business, that they're not isolated and left on their own because they have a different point of view. Is it almost down to that kind of personal interaction that's so important?
Yeah, I mean, there are, like I said earlier on, there are things that organisations do that have a positive can have a positive benefit to well-being, and if they do it badly, then it's a negative. And they're all interlinked. So when we talk about a holistic approach to well-being, people-centered leadership. Yeah, we know that people-centered leadership has more benefits, not only from a well-being perspective, but from a business performance perspective. Inclusion, diversity, and equity. We know that if you do that well, you become more inclusive. That has a huge benefit. You do it badly, then that's going to have a major impact on people's well-being. Change management. You do it well, you can enhance people's well-being by engaging them and including them within that process. You do it badly, people just feel like they've been dumped on, and that negatively impacts. So there's a whole bag of stuff that organisations do that can be, if done properly, enhance mental health and well-being. So it's not the danger is when we silo mental health and well-being and think of it as a standalone. It's not a standalone. It is a fundamental part of any business strategy. It has to be.
And I guess one other question, Glenn, that I haven't sort of touched on, and it just strikes me there is, you can't take your workforce as one kind of homogenous beast, particularly when, if it's a very heavily male workforce, for instance, where men naturally we're told are less open in coming forward if they are struggling, probably like yourself, you got to the point of breakdown. And that was the point where you were able to tell, your colleagues what was happening to you. But actually, I'm guessing you'd been going through difficult periods for quite a while before that. So how do you, encourage particularly men in a workforce to sort of engage with this kind of idea that mental health and well-being is important?
Role modelling. Yeah. Not just role modelling with colleagues, absolutely, but you see them, you see your footballers, you see your pop stars, all those sorts of things. Men coming out and saying, "I've struggled." That's a good thing. So take advantage of that, yeah. But also, like I say, their mates, if their mates are able to be open. I always remember a training session I did on site once, and it was to do with. We were training to team leaders, union reps, those people that have a direct impact. And I would say I think there were perhaps 20 people in the room, and one person stood up and as we were talking, and talked about his brother's suicide. Another person stood up and talked about his PTSD following an accident on site. Another person stood up and she talked about her daughter's anorexia. Yeah. So you create the environment and people will stand up and talk. Yeah. And one bloke stood up and said, "Yeah, this time last year I tried to take my own life." Now just imagine the impact of that in that room. So if you create the environment and you role model that what you're looking for, people will open up. Yeah, and that's construction site. Yeah, for macho, for a macho environment, mostly macho environment, it don't get much tougher when these people were being very open about their own experiences. So. And it can be done.
Yeah. And obviously, difficult times at the moment as well, lots of people in work, struggling with financial pressures, the cost of living. It's probably no better time, really, isn't it, for businesses to just be reflecting on this, and particularly today on World Mental Health Day.
Finance, there is a, if you like, a circular loop between money worries and mental health. People with money worries I would say mental ill health, not rather than mental health. People with money worries are more prone to mental ill health, and people with mental ill health tend to have more money worries. So there is a circular relationship between the two. And providing support, and this isn't just about paying people more money. That will help. There's no argument with that. It's about providing people with the skills, the understanding of financial management skills, or it's providing them with access to support. Might be small loans. It might be telling them where the food banks are. It might be it's all that sort of everything. Anything you can do. It might be free lunches. You know your staff. You know what you can do, and you know what you can afford to do.
Yeah.
I'm not a financial expert, and so I can't I wouldn't go into explaining all the sort of the ins and outs of all that. But what I do know is that if anything you do now to support your staff during this crisis will pay dividends in the future, because those staff will stay with you, they'll be loyal with you, and they will in the future look after you. So it's fundamental now, I think, that organisations get behind their business as much as possible.
Glenn, thank you so much for all that. That was a fascinating half hour and lots of insight, I think, that you've shared there. That's great. Thank you. I don't know if we do have any questions from the audience at the moment. Do please pop them over to us if you do. I guess the sort of, what would be your main sort of advice, Glenn? If there's one thing that you could impart today to help people who've joined us to understand, how important it is to have a workplace wellbeing strategy in place, what would you be saying?
The benefits are, I mean, the evidence for the benefits of a strategy are there. Yeah, the evidence is there. So the business case is already there. So that shouldn't necessarily be an argument against this. There are plenty of examples of it working. I think my biggest advice is just start. Do something. And build on that momentum, because once you start, you will find that people engage. When I was with Jacobs, they they bought out another organization, and when we were talking, as you bring two organizations together, there's a lot of talk about process, procedure, and this, that, and the other, and all that sort of stuff. And Jacobs are very big on their safety processes. And they did a lot around that. But it was mental health and well-being that engaged the new organization the most. It was the topic that brought people together. And at a global level, it is the topic that will that draw it. Depression in the UK is the same as depression in Australia, depression in Chile, depression in Sweden. It's the same thing. The language might be slightly different, and the approach to it might be different, but the root understanding, the core understanding of what people are feeling is the same everywhere, and it draws people together. So if you are looking at larger organizations, that it's just a subject that it binds. It's a subject that binds, because we all get it. We all experience poor mental health at some point in our lives, so we all get it.
We've got a question here from Kerry. Thank you very much for asking the question, Kerry. Kerry's saying, I recently did mental health first aid training and want to introduce monthly one-to-one wellbeing chats with all our remote team members. Do you have any advice on a good approach for these conversations?
When I'm not sure which he means MOT members, but I mean in terms of
remote team members. Sorry, Glenn.
Remote team members.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's listening. I train. I did train to become a mental health first aid instructor, and I think it serves a purpose. I deliver a different one as part of Workplace Wellbeing Academy, and they are a good start. I think as you get to understand the people you're talking to, you as a first aid or a wellbeing champion or whatever you want to call them, an ambassador, you'll get to understand the needs of not just the individual but the groups, and take that information back and sort of understand that as a wider network. So it's giving people the opportunity to say what they want to say and listen. Listening skills is absolutely fundamental.
And would you frame it as a mental health conversation? Because that's one of the things that strikes me. It's almost like it's better that you're chatting to somebody about something else, but you kind of leave the door open in the conversation that you can have maybe a more personal conversation with, how are you getting on? What's going on?
I would suggest that it starts out as a chat, and keep it light if you can. It's I'm touching base, because ultimately you want to start building that trust. And once you build that trust, and it may not happen the first call, it might not happen the second call, it might, but as you build that trust, people are going to be more willing to be open up about these things. So they are. I would classify them as check-ins rather than rather than mental health conversations.
Yeah. Well, Kerry says that they're a good listener, which is good. So that's a great starting point, Kerry. I'm sure those one-to-ones will go very well. But as Glenn's saying, frame them as something slightly different. And as you said, Glenn, the conversation might not open up for a few conversations, if you see what I mean. So don't push it, but just listen. And Kerry's saying there, likes the idea of making it a touching base check-in call. And I think sometimes you can frame these things as it's got to be about your mental health or your well-being that we're talking today. And actually, that's probably the worst approach, isn't it, Glenn, I guess? Because that then, there's pressure for a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And people are uncomfortable. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of routes of support, because people might be happy to doing that, but actually they still might be uncomfortable talking to somebody about it. So having access to other routes of support would, and that can be communicated through those conversations as well. So.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks once again, Glenn, and Kerry. I hope that's given you some good pointers for the conversations that you're going to have. Really appreciate you joining us today, Glenn. If anybody's joined us today and don't really know much about what we do here at Frog Systems, we do a lot of what Glenn's been talking about, actually. First line employee mental health and wellbeing support through a digital platform. You can follow us on social media. We'll be putting this recorded conversation up on our YouTube account, so you can watch it on demand later or share it with your colleagues. And you can find out much more if you want to follow our social media accounts. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. And Glenn, thank you for your company. I'm sure we'll be chatting again to you in the future as well. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thanks very much.